Hey everyone, this is the inaugural MicroProfile 1.4 planning call, and it's relatively short notice, and I kind of foobarred the invite for this call in terms of the Blue Jeans ID, but the calendar's updated, and I did send a meeting update to the Google group. So. The URLs posted for the planning meeting notes. I've got a how-to guide draft template and then a how-to guide sign-up sheet. And I'm going to paste this in the meeting notes as well. Everyone should have the rights to access and edit / update these documents. It's open to the world, right? So feel free to provide comments during and after this meeting, right?
This is going to be a recurrent meeting, right?
Yeah. It's going to be a little spotty, and the reason is I have a tremendous amount of travel coming up with a lot of meetings.
Okay.
So I am going to try and set something up for a week from today, because I do have that's a day when I don't have travel. Although I'll still be actually out of the country, but it's a day where I don't have anything planned, so I'll be able to actually do
make
work.
a suggestion?
Yeah.
In the meeting invite in the MicroProfile calendar, would you mind when you correct the Blue Jeans number in it? Can you add links to these two documents to the invite?
Yep.
Great,
Yep.
thank you.
Okay. So this release, as we know, we're going to focus around developer enablement, and really, I think that just means explaining to developers how to develop with the MicroProfile technologies, right? And there's various ways that we can do that. And the ideas I had kind of thought of up front were, there's how-to documents, how-to guides. There's video vlogs, right, or on the YouTube channel that we can do, right, and maybe even set up a specific kind of channel or what do you call them in YouTube? Kind of a list of all the videos that we can do in one list. And if we want to do a blog series, we can, but I'm looking for something much more kind of static and reliable that developers can kind of all go to. As it's kind of a more formal than a blog, right? Blogs tend to be a little bit less formal in terms of write-ups. I'm open to other ideas as well. I don't know what other folks have and things in terms of developer enablement.
No, I think that sounds good to have that, and also, as you say, in a more well, I'm not saying static way, but more close together. Where if it's, let's say, on a Red Hat developer blog, I mean, between each of the articles there are 15 others talking about Linux and some crap that we don't even know about. So there is no, it's hard to find them.
So this would be like the source of truth, right? It would go here.
Sorry, what is this?
The set of guides, wherever we decide to put them.
Yeah, they'll be the source of truth in terms of how to use MicroProfile technologies.
Right.
Yeah, I would like them to be the source of truth, and if other vendors want to leverage that content or link to it or even completely create their own that's specific to the product, that's fine. But just from a community perspective, I would like this to kind of be a source of truth.
The challenge is going to be when it comes to the deployment part of the sample or the guide. Like, the guide will show somebody how to, let's say, code config, different ways to use the config API. But then is the guy going to stop there, or is it going to go into, how do you deploy this and run it? And then that's the challenge, because every implementer implements MicroProfile in their own product, in their own way too. So what are we going to do with that, right?
This is a good point, and this is also going to be a bit of a challenge. So I did kind of chat with Kevin briefly about this, and there's just two ideas about this. One is that we could, include directions for each runtime instructions, and I think the way that we would do that is try and genericize, here's how you use all the how-to guides with this particular runtime, right? If we can find some way to standardize it. So that, what we might even do is have a separate page for each runtime. Here's how you use this runtime for each of these how-tos, right? So we can kind of do it once and just reuse that for every single how-to. Right, so that might require a little bit of finessing depending on these how-tos, because some of them might be fairly complex where a generic set of instructions may not apply. My initial thought behind that is like the JWT one, right? That might require some specialized setup. And that kind of gets me to point two. There's going to be an exception to that rule, right? Where some of the how-tos might be complex enough where there might be specific setup instructions required for each runtime, right? So that's an idea. In practice, I don't know how doable that is. It might be that we start with one how-to, write it up, and try and create a generic kind of, this is how you use it with our, with a particular vendor's runtime, right?
Yeah, John, I don't know that we want to. I mean, I understand that this is going to be kind of a trial and error type of experience, but I don't think we want to just limit it and say, well, let's just do one and see how it works out, because by the end of this quarter we'll only have one.
Okay.
I think what John proposed to have basically two sections, two major sections. One is talking about the individual specs or also how they interrelate, and the other one talking on how to get this running in a very general way, like if wildfly swarm, you run maven wildfly run, and to get this going, while on Liberty you go like bin startup and copy that over or something. Just have these sections, and then if it's really necessary that on a runtime you need a different source, then for one of the experiments, to add that, to refer to the main setup guide, and then saying, okay, for this to work, you also need to add security credentials in the run/conf.foo file.
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be a very viable way.
Yeah, the one thing I'm trying to avoid is that we have, let's say 500 characters minus source code, right? 500 characters on here's the how-to, right? Here's what it is, here's what it does, and then 10,000 10,000 words for here's how you set it up and use it with 7 different runtimes.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
That's what I'm basically trying to avoid.
But this is, I guess, not the normal case, because the normal case is you have these separated setup guides for the runtimes where you just mention that once, and then per program example, you would have a section like deploying, and this would either say, okay, just normally as described in the setup per runtime section, or in these special cases, you would say, okay, on top of that, you need X, Y, Z. But I don't think this is like you just feared.
Yeah, we hope not. I think where it could get into that is if we go back to Cesar's question, and what if someone starts writing up on how to deploy into an Istio environment, or something like that, and that's where that could really expand. So that's where I think we just have to be careful on how much detail or how implementation specific are we going to allow these how-to guides? I mean, I agree with you, Heiko, that we should keep them limited to just building the actual application, and how to deploy it is a separate item.
Yeah, and even with the deployment, I mean, if we just say, okay, this is how you get it going on Liberty, and this is how you get it going on Swarm in this separate section, I think we already cover a lot. Of course, there are these nice things like Istio and Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry and whatnot. But I think once we have described how to get that going on Liberty or on Swarm, and people can find on a different place how to deploy Swarm on OpenShift or Liberty on Cloud Foundry, then we basically have done our duty to kickstart that.
Right.
Right. So we almost need like a set of borders that we need to put within this effort, so that we don't go, one vendor starts writing a bunch of stuff in their section for specific to whatever, Liberty or Swarm or something.
Yeah, and by the way, I think it's great if that happens, but it would have to happen, outside of this effort, right?
Right.
So, yeah, all power to go off and do that, because I think it would be great. So,
So, John, one thing I wanted to mention, we were talking about, these guides and having, the central location in order to have them available. I would like to have the ability to point off at other guides. I know that the one that we did for Liberty, that's off of Open Liberty for the MicroProfile guide, that one's been getting a lot of traction. I heard Mike Croft even reference it in his talk at DevOps last fall. So I think it would be good if we can provide links out to other guides as well.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Another thing is, where are we going to store the guide? Is it going to be a separate repository, or will be linked off MicroProfile.io?
Well, I would like for the kind of canonical examples, the community-centric examples, to all be within the MicroProfile properties, right? So if we do this all in ASCII doc, for example, right, then we can just have a repo that's just for the how-to guides, for instance.
Right.
And we could do this. I don't want to get into the technology now. If we want to, do ASCII doc or get books and so on, but I would like these to be stored. Well, the question is, I guess, should they be stored in their own repo, or should the how-tos be in the repo of the technology that we're showing the how-to of?
No, that should be separate, I think, in a very central place, all in one, so that it's also very easy to cross-reference. So, for example, in metrics, we have some setup that requires now config and will do even more. So it should be pretty trivial to link to config and have one click to read it up on config if someone wants to know more details.
Yep.
But do we want to make the user guide another task as part of a sub-project release process, so that before you issue config 2.0, you have to update the config or that section of the guide, with whatever new calls there are, new functionality, before you can release config 2.0, for example? We want to do that? I mean, I know I'm getting ahead of this conversation, but
yeah,
think about.
I like that idea, Cesar. I don't think that we're ready to do that yet, but I do think that would be worthwhile down the road to have something like that, because otherwise we keep getting ahead, and then once we get done with the spec, it's like, okay, what's the next thing? And we always have good intentions of providing these guides and how-tos or blogs, and we never get around to it. And I'm as guilty as everybody.
Yeah, that's
part of. Go ahead, Emily.
sorry. It's also if we really want to link to the particular like spec and etc. It depends on for this guide. Are we going to deliver the code example, or is it basically live code? So and we have like for example the Maven project, you have POM XML and then pull in the which particular version of the spec. In that case, I think I agree with with Cesar, and it should be always up to date. It depends on the content we are going to deliver for that guide.
Yeah, we tend to lead with specs first, though, right, and follow up with implementations. And so you can have a how-to guide, but then we're in this position where it's going to be some point in time before anyone will actually be able to do anything with it, right? And so that worries me a little bit. I love the idea of having the how-to guide as part of the deliverable, right? So we have a TCK, we got a spec, and also shipping how-to guides along with that. I think it'd be really good because it also forces you to keep them up to date, right? So I love the idea, but what does that mean in the context of? Okay, here's how you do it, but you can't yet because we need an implementation. Thoughts?
Right, and also there's the issue of the implementations among all of the vendors within the community. They come out at different times.
Yeah. So I suspect what we could do is update the user guide, the how-to guide as implementations become available. Right. So provide. Well, let's see. How do I do this? Yeah. One of the problems about having a common installation guide, a common setup guide, is that guide may not. How do I say this? That vendor may not yet have implemented the technology, right, or the latest update, but the setup guide will still be there. So people will try it and it won't work, right? That's one problem of having kind of a common setup and configuration. So it might be that in the how-to guide, we do define here's the current implementations that support this how-to guide, and then we'll just have to keep that current.
Yeah, I mean, this could be on the individual how-to for the individual spec, could be just list of implementations. And if you have one of those, go there for the setup. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Another thing is for this how-to guide, is this each spec will need to create a how-to guide, or is it basically is one how-to repo and then demonstrate every each individual spec? From what I can gather, and like each individual spec is more focused on the development, and for this how-to guide, we kind of focus on from the beginning to the end. Basically, you deliver your application and then you can deploy it, for example, to the Istio and etc. Or the Cloud Foundry.
Yeah, I think that gets back to what Kevin might have been bringing up, where maybe we could provide, we could offer links to other examples or documentation outside of this repo or these how-tos that explain how to do something with this spec in more detail, right, or in a different context. Because part of the problem is developers may not really, they either may not be running Istio, they may not be running Cloud Foundry, maybe they're just running on raw metal. We don't have anything in MicroProfile specifically about running it in a cloud environment yet, right? We've kind of been bouncing around that idea, maybe abstractly in MicroProfile too. But it worries me a little bit if we go too far with the context that these applications will be developed in the core how-to guides.
I mean, Emily, for fault tolerance, you can certainly mention that if this is running with, for example, Istio, then you want to disable it by providing the following config option for that and that reason. I mean, this is not forbidden, but I doubt we should have a full run this on Istio guide with all the Istio settings. I think this is just goes overboard.
Oh, I thought it's like we are trying to target like the audience with the kind of bigger story from the start to the end, like from the development to the deployment. So
not with the how-to guides. The how-to guides really are, here's how I use this API, right? Period. Here's how I use config.
right.
You know, in fact, there's multiple how-to guides. This is a topic I wanted to get into maybe a little bit later, but maybe there's one on here's how I use the Java API, and here's how I use the CDI API, right? Here, you know, maybe is part of another how-to guide is here's how I switch between, you know, using a properties file versus using a, you know, environmental variables or something. I'm just making stuff up, but my point is that I think for the how-to guides delivered in the community, they have to support the technologies that are available in the community, and I think they have to stay very simple about how to use the APIs.
Okay, so basically, yeah, I joined in the middle. So I thought we are talking about the full life cycle. If we just focus on how to use the APIs, yeah, like just demonstrate how to use a particular annotations and etc.
Yeah, I mean, Emily, this whole guide or this whole set of how-tos certainly has the how do I deploy that whole thing then on Open Liberty or on Wildfly Swarm so that people can really get going with this guide and only this guide and not need to Google around. But this is not the focus, I guess, of this part of this documentation, and is deployed on Open Liberty and whatnot. It's just a different section for the runtimes where new runtimes that it implemented will just add their sections in and can be referenced then.
Okay, okay. In this case, I quite like what Kevin suggested. Maybe like in like MicroProfile, we just demonstrate how to use the API, and then period, like John said, is application ready, and then we can link, do a link like link to like Open Liberty guide, for example, and then with this app, how can I deploy to Open Liberty? Maybe Open Liberty guide has, oh, okay, I can show you how to deploy to Istio. And similarly, probably happen for the Wildfly.
Yeah, I think these more advanced techniques like how do I deploy that Open Liberty with my application and my concept to Istio, that's probably could be separate or linked off. But for the start, I mean, we should, and at the end, you can run all of the implementations on bare metal in some form when you have a JVM. So this is basically the scope that I see. Get this running on an implementation on bare metal, and with a certain concept, and so basically this one, get it from start to end. So until it's running, and then you perhaps also can add some curl commands like for health checks or metrics, or also for fault tolerance, where you show, okay, if you run this curl command and you see the retries or it's failing, and then it's giving you the default result. That's all part of the how-to. But this larger thing, if someone finds out how to get that going and running on bare metal, then they are already pretty advanced with the microprofile concepts, and then they can deploy it to Istio or OpenShift or Cloud Foundry or Bluemix just with other guides.
Yeah, we can just put a link there, but not a focus, not host the content there. Yeah. Okay.
So wouldn't that be pretty much a reference implementation, like on bare metal?
No, it's not like a reference implementation. It's more the keep it small and simple principle.
And vendor neutral.
Well, perhaps vendor neutral. Well, not exactly, because you have this section of how you deploy to each implementation, but it's rather you should not need to care about all the extra setup on OpenShift, Bluemix, whatever, that all have their additional descriptors and whatnot. That would confuse people and deviate from the core microprofile principles.
Yeah, the other sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, just to expand on that a little bit. Cesar asked about a reference implementation. Well, the first person that writes one of these, let's say Heiko writes one on metrics, I would guess his deployment section is going to focus on Swarm because that's what he's most familiar with. And then maybe as, Andro comes on board with Pyara, maybe he'll add a little bit to it to explain, okay, this is how you build and deploy it on Pyara. And then Emily comes along and does it for Open Liberty. So yeah, I would guess that the first person that writes it is going to have his expertise, his or her expertise, particular but it will expand a little bit. But if it gets to the point where we are looking to how to deploy it into a cloud environment, then that's where, okay, now we go off. We point off to other resources for that. Does that make sense, Cesar?
Yeah, it does. It's just I'm a little afraid of because we have vendors of different sizes and vendors with different I guess amount of resources dedicated to this effort as far as the implementation is concerned. And I'm just worried that the first one to implement the latest standard will be the first one that puts in theoretically, right? That updates the guide or that deployment portion of the guide. And I'm thinking that they may get an unfair advantage if they're always the first ones implementing, the latest releases of the different sub-projects. I'm not sure. Just a thought. What do you guys think?
I don't know. I guess from that perspective, if someone is out in the lead like that, well, then that's more power to the whole community because we're just trying to generate interest in MicroProfile. That's my view. I don't know.
Right.
I think part of the problem is if we can't, and this is going to sound really negative. It's not intended to be. We can't move as fast as the one that's the last to deliver the functionality for any particular release, right? We need to be able to. I think as soon as the specs come out, it would be great if developers could be able to use that spec.
Yeah. So John, I think a good example is actually Tommy Tribe. I mean, I don't think anyone is on from Tommy Tribe, but they've been lacking a little bit on their implementation, but they've been in the lead for promoting MicroProfile at the conferences and trying to do samples and talks. So heck, they could start doing these how-tos and promoting MicroProfile, and they don't even have an implementation yet.
I mean, Cesar certainly has a point here, but that happens already today, where an implementer that has a feature implemented will talk about it and tweet about it. I mean,
yep.
so they already have this perhaps little more mind share. But I guess on the other hand, for the MicroProfile effort itself, it's good when a new guide is available as soon as possible and outlining the new possibilities or the updated possibilities. And it may even help some other implementers better understanding the spec and the TCK. So when things are explained by code and by illustrated code, so that they better understand what that really means.
Okay. All right. So it sounds like the user guides will and should include the deployment sections for each of the vendors.
Yeah, but I guess this deployment section, 80% or 90% of that will be written once and will stay the same over the implementations. So for Wildfly Swarm, I mean, I would just update the version number in the POM, and that's all for a new spec. But otherwise, how to deploy it is always the same 3 Maven commands.
Yeah. Another thing is to make access feel a little bit better is for this maybe we have a separate release cycle, and as soon as for example like OpenAPI just finished implementing OpenAPI, for example, or we wrote this guide and then like next day and Wildfly has done the same, and then you can add the section deployment section straight away to that guide. I think it's overall that means we just trying to encourage each other to implement the specs. And then it shows to the community actually we care about it.
Right.
All right. So it shouldn't be a concern. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I understand it's definitely it can be considered a bit of a sensitive area. So I definitely understand kind of the concern. But you know, if we're going to create specs, when implementations start coming out, it would be really nice for developers to be able to actually kind of go to the community and see how to use it with the available runtimes. So, so does that mean then from, sorry, I didn't quite, I heard it talked about in different ways. Does this mean that we include the how-to with each implementation actually embedded in the how-to, or do we link off to external documentation to a separate doc on how to do it with each runtime?
I would keep the how-to deployed on an implementation in this set of how-tos. So if you look at a book, you would have 2 sections. The first one are the how-tos, which show the actual code and code examples, so these small how-tos. And the second section would have a chapter per runtime that explains how to get it to work on that runtime, or so how to set that up and how to deploy it on that runtime.
I'm hoping it's as simple in a lot of cases as Maven, build package whatever -p runtime, right? And then maybe a second one if you have to, a java-jar or some other way, right? I'm kind of hoping it's as simple as that for a lot of these how-tos. Some of them, like I said, might be actually much more difficult. Some configuration may be required.
My suggestion would be to do one, pick one of the subprojects, do the user guide, well, especially for the deployment portion, the vendor-specific portion, to get a better understanding of what we should include and what we should not include.
Yeah, we're kind of guessing, right. And until we actually dive in and actually have to do one of these, we don't know how complicated the instructions are going to be.
Right.
Yep.
But that was my earlier point. We should actually try one.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
I know, but
you shot me down, Kevin.
But wait. These are
come full circle.
Qualified it by saying just the deployment section.
Yeah. Yeah, because the other stuff this should be the same for everybody, right?
Yeah.
I to avoid cases where when we do it the first time for, let's say, config, and sorry to pick on config, but you know, and we get to the deployment section, and Red Hat section is you know, 1/3 of a page, and then IBM's section is 5 pages. Then you know, we need to figure out, you know,
Yeah,
how great IBM Liberty is.
Yeah, you had to go there, Cesar, didn't you?
Maybe just assign a smaller font.
So then I think that exercise would allow us to have a discussion and figure out what are the parameters and
Yep.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
Here I would like to suggest. I was listening for a while. Hello, everybody. I basically agree with what you were saying, but I wanted to suggest one thing, to agree on one or several rules for the documentation, and one thing which could help simplify things is to either create a document which is only MicroProfile, general to MicroProfile, and if we want to talk about vendor-specific things, it should be a separate document. So we could have a deployment guide for just MicroProfile, like example of a POM project with dependencies, and maybe a simple hello world class, and specify this needs to be done by the vendor implementation and things that are required to be set up on the vendor side. And then we could have links to vendor specific parts, but not what I would like to suggest is not to include vendor specific parts in the general documents, rather to split the parts into different documents. Yes. And always, if we always keep this rule, then we can also tag these documents and then filter them in a page. If we have a page where we have a select box and people are only interested, let's say, to Open Liberty, they would just pick Open Liberty, and then they would see Open Liberty at the top of these vendor-specific links or something like that.
Yeah, so I've just pasted in 2 links, probably in the wrong order. So the second link is a general article about the monitoring, so about MicroProfile metrics and MicroProfile health checks. And then the second article, so the first one does not talk about deploying on a concrete implementation, right? It's just talking about the concepts and an example and so on. And then the second block is then bringing in the concrete examples of 2 servers, so in this case Open Liberty and in Wildfly Swarm, so on how to really get that working on these servers. I think that could be or is sort of what I have in mind here.
I like that. I also like the logo there. If we have a MicroProfile logo, plain MicroProfile logo, it should hint that it's general, and then we could have vendor logo next to MicroProfile logo, and it would point out that it contains vendor specific things. Like if we present it on a web page, not the ASCII doc. But ASCII doc already could contain a tag, specify these metadata about the documents.
Yes.
Okay, so let's see here. I'm going back to the notes here. I'm trying to keep up. So it sounds like, from a how-to perspective, if I understood your comment, Heiko, correctly, your second document is more like the how-to guide in the first half, right?
Yeah, from the second link is like the first half, yes.
Yeah, right. And then the second link is more like the second half of the document.
Yes.
Or sorry, the first link is more like the second half of the document.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
In other words, I think we can say that one of the documents should be available to everybody, or everybody would be interested in this, and the second vendor-specific thing would be only for people interested in the implementation, in the specific implementation. So not everybody would be interested in these documents because they use different implementation.
Yeah, so basically this link that says monitor server Prometheus, that could be split in multiple documents by implementation, right? So that that would be the implementation specific one that always tells just once per this whole book on how to get this going and so on for this vendor or for this implementation, not vendor. And it's the one that says monitoring aspects. That's the generic one that is not vendor specific and that tells the concepts of the respective MicroProfile specification.
So I'm trying to get my head around, around about this whole thing about deliverables. For example, let's just take a config, for example. In the how-to guide, I can see the deliverable is the source code. The code section will be I create my app, basically my Hello World app, and then demonstrate how to use the APIs. And then in the Axie doc, I just described the whole thing, like explain why explain how this API can be used.
No, in the second document. I think in the first one, when you show in config, like I have set up a property X, and you would even could even say, okay, on Java -d X equals, you can pass it around or via the command line. That would all be in this first how-to. And the second document would be that very likely would exist only once for OpenLiberty, once for Swarm, once for Payara, where it explains like, okay, you get the implementation from there, unzip it, copy the result of so build the application, Maven install, and then from target copy the war into server/runtime/deployments. Start with startup.sh, and then you have that running on Liberty, right? So I think that would only exist once. You don't need to provide the exact same thing again for config, for fault tolerance, and for metrics, because that's just the section. How do you get it up and running? This implementation.
It's, I'm not talking the content of the second section. So basically, I'm still go back to the config section. So the deliverable is the code will be the Hello World application. The spec, the kind of the deliverable for the doc will be just talk around this application development. So, and then the second part about how to deliver to the different servers. So that would be a separate repo, right? Because like one for OpenLiberty, one for Wildfly, one for Payara. And this kind of independent with what app you are writing, let it be config for tolerance or something else. Is that correct?
Yes and no. I mean, you could have it as a separate or as separate repositories. I would just put that as the different directory in one repository where all these how-tos end up. And just also within the ASCII doc or in the overall document, just have that as a second part where all these things are shown.
I think in the end, maybe the better solution would be to split it into different, but we can start with simple things, keep everything in one repository. And then I can imagine that later multiple repositories would be better because they can be outside of the Eclipse. The vendor-specific things can be outside of Eclipse, and then, for example, for Payara, anybody from Payara could contribute to Payara-specific repository, and they wouldn't have to be part of the Eclipse project. But for start, we can start with just one single repository.
Yeah,
but
so
according to what?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think it's to learn from the mistake in the past. If we start from one repository, it's very difficult to split again. It's really, really important to get it right to start with. I think I will prefer like we do one repository for the config, and then the vendor kind of the part two, and then they can create another repository. And it's fine, like to all the vendor use the same repository, but it's I think I would like to split them up.
I mean, at the end, we want to have one coherent document or document tree somewhere on MicroProfile.io. And for this to happen, I think it's also very important that these things live together, that it's very easy to cross-link and everything. If we have dozens of repositories, then we have the problem of finding things, unifying things together, assembling that. Perhaps even like we don't have a BOM today, we will also not have a common set of tags that are used across all these things. We don't have a common set of CSS potentially that is used around the document. So I think this should really be one repository where, I mean, just from the practical doing, we all have the access, can write to it, can merge it. So this is not a problem. And then we have just a little bit of a directory structure as a hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
So part 1 and part 2 in different subtrees of that.
Yeah, one thing I think is to have a multiple repositories make the micro release easier. I think is probably this is the options we have. I think we shouldn't make a decision here because just 6 of us. I think we should have it discussed in the mailing list.
Maybe we can try both approaches and see what works best for everybody.
So
yeah, so I was going to say we only have 4 minutes left.
Yeah.
We only have 4 minutes left, so I was going to try and get an action item out, kind of where let's not worry about the technology that we use or where we store the repo right now. What I'm trying to figure out is what's the right approach to actually writing them up, right? So we talked about, for example, Heiko's metrics two posts, right, where one is simply here's a use case, and we want to keep these, I think, relatively short and succinct. This is a how-to guide, not necessarily a developer guide, right? And it's a separate question if we want to have a developer guide as well, right? So the how-to guide is a brief description of here's the problem we're trying to solve. Here's the steps you take in terms of writing the code, right? And here's maybe an explanation line by line of the code that we're writing and why it's relevant. And then go off and build it, right? So then they need to be very short and I think very short and succinct. And it would be good if we could maybe write up an example of how to do that and then have, as a part of that, a deployment across a couple of different runtimes just to see how much that's going to take to actually go off and write the deployment section or the run it section. Any volunteers? Okay, I'll volunteer. I'll volunteer for one. Okay, so I'll pick one. I'm going to say it right now. I'm going to pick one. The one if you're upset I didn't pick yours, please don't be upset. Mm-hmm. The runtimes I use, I'll see how many I'll probably pick something that's across a lot of the runtimes and try and get them running on each one of the runtimes, right? And I'll try and have that by maybe next Friday. I think I'm going to schedule another meeting like this for next Friday. Does that sound okay?
Sure.
You obviously have a lot of time to pass on flights and on airports.
That's exactly right. I was going to do it actually on the flight and at the airport. You nailed it.
Okay.
So,
I'll cross-read that on Monday evening then.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll sign up for that, and I'll post an example somewhere, and I'll update the thread in the Google group. Okay. And this is just a first crack at it, and it's used as a discussion point. Okay.
Excellent.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. And I'll see you guys online, and have a wonderful weekend.
You too, John,
You too.
and everybody.
Thank
See you on
Bye,
Monday,
guys.
John. Have a safe flight.
Yeah, see you on Monday. All right, bye.
Bye.
Bye.